All right, sweet. We ready? Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining today's webinar on getting ready for NLHC's Hill Day. We are delighted to have you all here. I am going to get our slides posted right now as soon as I share my screen. Oop, wrong PowerPoint. All righty. Sweet. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. So like I said, we're here for NLHC's Hill Day Prep webinar. Sorry, my other computer just logged itself out, so I have to fix that. All right, we're thriving here. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm policy manager here with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And before we get started, I wanted to give a quick rundown of the agenda today, but I also really wanted to extend our heartfelt thanks to all of you for joining. Your advocacy is so needed always, but especially this year. We are facing a very steep uphill path towards increased housing investments for the federal affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs that we all care so deeply about. And hearing directly from constituents is going to make all of the difference for members of Congress. So thank you for being here, for volunteering your time, energy, and expertise to take these Hill meetings. We cannot thank you enough. So today we are going to give you all of the information and materials that you need to have a successful Hill Day visit. We're going to start off with a quick hello and welcome from our president and CEO, Diane Yuntel, who unfortunately could not be here to join us live, but did provide a recording. Then I'm going to jump into an overview of our policy priorities for Hill Day this year. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Gabby Ross, to go over NLHC's Hill Day advocacy resources. We'll then turn it over to Andrew Bradley from Prosperity, Indiana, who has had ample experience in taking Hill meetings both in person and virtually, and we'll share what to expect on Hill Day. And finally, we are going to hear from Marisol Bello, Executive Director of the Housing Narrative Lab, to talk about how advocates can weave in personal narrative with policy priorities to create an impactful message to their members of Congress. And of course, we are going to have time at the end to answer any questions you might have, but don't let today's conversation end here. We are happy to help you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, let's get started. So here are some remarks from Diane Yuntel, our president and CEO, who just wanted to thank you all for participating. Let's see if I can make go. Perfect. Oh.
I can't hear the audio.
Oh, really? Can other folks hear the audio? No? Okay. Okay. Well.
Kim, stop sharing the slide, reshare it, and click the 2 bars at the bottom when you share it again.
Oh, okay. Share screen.
You should see at the bottom, like enable sound.
I do see it. Thank you. For folks who are on the call, that is May, our comms genius, who runs all of our presentations and slides. So thank you very much, May, for providing some quick TA. So let's try this again.
Proven solutions. Hello. It's good to have you all here. Thanks so much for joining today's prep call for our upcoming Capitol Hill Day in Washington, D.C. and virtually. I'm so glad that you'll be scheduling meetings with your members of Congress to urge that they protect and support proven solutions to homelessness and housing poverty, and to advance policies that can move us towards housing justice. You'll be meeting with your senators and representatives or their staff at a truly critical moment when our collective advocacy is essential. In Congress, House Republicans are threatening to default on our nation's debt as leverage to demand dramatic cuts to domestic investments, including affordable housing and homelessness resources. This tactic was used by House Republicans back in 2011, and it led to 10 years of very low spending caps that made it impossible to fund solutions to our housing and homelessness crisis at the scale needed. Our communities, our neighbors, our country cannot afford another decade of spending cuts to critical housing investments, especially at a time when pandemic-era renter protections are expiring, when resources are being depleted, and when the lowest income renters are confronted with inflation, out-of-reach rents, increased evictions, and in many communities, more homelessness. So this year will be challenging, but advocates across the country are up for the task. I know that we can defeat this significant threat together because we have seen just how powerful and effective our collective advocacy can be through the unprecedented resources and protections that we achieved during the pandemic. So we can and we will do it again. And at the same time, we can't lose sight of the need to advance housing justice. We have to be successful in blocking efforts to dramatically cut housing investments, but we can't stop there. We have to continue to build the political will for the long-term solutions we need to ensure that the lowest income people have affordable, accessible, quality homes in the communities of their choice. So we have to work together to do both. And today you'll hear much more from the incredible team at NLIHC about how to do that, about the major threats and the opportunities before us this year, and about ways to talk with your members of Congress to protect and expand proven solutions. So thanks so much again for joining today, and even more so, thanks for joining us on Capitol Hill Day in just a few weeks. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
All right. And so with those inspiring words from Diane, let's jump right in. So, like Diane said, the negotiations over spending this year are the single biggest legislative threat to affordable housing investments and the millions of people who are in need of housing assistance. House Republicans are calling for deep spending cuts in exchange for voting to raise the debt limit, threatening to allow the government to default on its debt obligations unless they get those steep spending cuts. And I want to be clear, the debt limit and the federal budget are two separate, although related concepts. The debt limit is the legal limit on the amount of debt the federal government can accrue. It is a political and accounting obligation and not necessarily a reflection of economic stability. Raising the debt limit is necessary to pay off financial obligations that we have already incurred. So basically, we need to raise the debt limit in order to pay our bills. Congress has raised or suspended the debt limit over 100 times since it was created. And the federal budget proposes no new spending. In our case, spending for affordable housing and homelessness resources that are vital to ensuring that people are able to keep a roof over their heads. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the US could default on its debt between July and September of this year if Congress doesn't act. And in the fight to become House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy promised far-right facets of his party to cap FY24 spending at FY 2022 levels. And while the specifics around how those cuts would be made have yet to be unveiled, according to an analysis from our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, such a cap could result in cuts of 24% across the board. The Senate Democratic Policy and Communications Committee also released their own analysis of the impact of such a proposal. And depending on how cuts are made, capping FY24 spending at FY22 levels would result in a funding decrease of between 12% if cuts were made equally across all programs, including defense, and 30% if Defense and Veteran Affairs medical care were spared from those cuts. And of course, those steep cuts would exacerbate an already existing affordable housing and homelessness crisis that is only getting worse. Capping FY24 funding at FY22 levels would reduce HUD rental assistance and homelessness assistance by $6.6 billion, putting hundreds of thousands of people who rely on that assistance at risk of housing instability, eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. Public housing authorities would be forced to pull existing vouchers from families who are searching for units or sever assistance altogether. It would reduce funding to programs like the Home Investment Partnership Program, resulting in 1,700 fewer affordable housing units constructed and 1,300 households losing their rental assistance. It would increase children's risk of exposure to lead-based paint by cutting $48 million in funding to address lead and other health hazards in low-income housing, which would impact an estimated 3,000 households. It would exacerbate the affordable housing shortage in Native territories by cutting $120 million from Native American housing programs. And it would reduce funding to the low-income home energy assistance program, or LIHEAP, by $472 million, leaving many families with low incomes unable to heat or cool their homes, even in dangerous weather conditions. And I cannot emphasize this enough. It is unacceptable to balance the nation's budget on the backs of the lowest income people. People rely on this funding to keep a roof over their heads, to keep food on their table, to ensure that their kids have the resources they need to go to school. And it is unacceptable to cut funding to these vital programs in order to maintain a made-up number. So again, like Diane said in her opening statement, previous debt limit negotiations under the Obama-Biden administration led to the enactment of the Budget Control Act of 2011, which established statutory limits on discretionary spending that spanned a decade. So FY 2021 to FY 2012 to FY 2021. And if those limits were not followed and appropriations exceeded that statutory limit, it triggered automatic across-the-board cuts to programs, also known as sequestration, to balance that excess spending. The Budget Control Act also required annual reductions in discretionary spending limits from FY12 to FY21, with the exception of certain programs like SNAP, CHIP, TANF, and Medicare. And as a result of those steep budget cuts or budget caps, the Budget Control Act constrained HUD appropriations for a decade. And even after the recent post-Budget Control Act appropriation cycle, HUD has still received an estimated $29 billion less than it would have had appropriations remained at FY 2010 levels and just adjusted for inflation from year to year. So that brings us to our asks for this Hill Day. Our top priorities for FY24 are, of course, no cuts to affordable housing and homelessness programs. We cannot afford to go backwards on this funding. We are also asking for full funding for the Housing Choice Voucher Program in order to renew all existing vouchers and to expand assistance to an additional 200,000 households in need. We're asking for full funding for public housing and homelessness assistance grants, $3 billion for emergency rental assistance, $100 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions, expanded tribal funding for tribal nations with the greatest needs. So far, House Republicans have been very shady, I guess, and reluctant to provide specifics about what programs would face cuts. And that's in large part because they know it would be unpopular. It is unpopular to name deep cuts to specific programs that help people. House Republicans are expected to release a top-line proposal in April after the president's budget request is released in early March. So our goal for this Hill Day is going to keep that pressure on. Make sure that members of Congress know the real tangible impact of these proposed cuts. This is not just about a top-line number. This is not just about or rather bottom line number. This is not just about money being saved. These are people's lives at stake. These are people's livelihoods at stake. And we cannot allow these rollbacks to happen. So in addition to our work around appropriations and the federal budget, there are also going to be opportunities to advance some bipartisan legislation. So our other policy priorities for this coming Capitol Hill Day include the Eviction Crisis Act, which was introduced in the last Congress with bipartisan support by Senators Michael Bennet and Todd Young. And that bill would create a permanent federal emergency rental assistance program that would provide assistance to households that are facing a sudden economic crisis, putting their housing stability at risk. It would also build on the lessons learned and infrastructure developed during the pandemic that helps facilitate the distribution of emergency rental assistance. And we have the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, again, introduced with bipartisan support by Senators Todd Young and Chris Van Hollen. That bill would fund 500,000 new housing choice vouchers along with mobility counseling for families with young children so that they can use those vouchers in neighborhoods of their choice, including areas with access to important things like quality schools, reliable public transit, and higher paying jobs. So our target for Hill Day is pretty simple: everyone. Talk to everyone. No, really, talk to everyone. I want people to be sick of hearing NLIHC's name and sick of seeing our faces. Every member of Congress is going to make the difference. Every member of Congress needs to weigh in on appropriations. So every single vote counts. We need everybody really rowing in the same direction in order to defend and expand these budget investments in FY 2024. And for the bipartisan legislation, we are courting some moderate-ish Republicans to build that bipartisan support and co-sponsorship for those bills so that we can move them across the finish line. And with that, I believe that is my last slide. I am going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Gabby Ross, who will talk about some of the advocacy resources that we've prepared for you for Hill Day. Gabby, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby Ross, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with NLIHC's field team. Today, I'm going to give an overview of our advocacy resources that you can use for this upcoming Hill Day and beyond. In our recently released Budget Advocacy Toolkit, we feature several advocacy actions you all can take, but I'm going to specifically highlight the portion that discusses scheduling meetings with members of Congress and their staff. I do want to note in the toolkit I've just mentioned, it discusses scheduling in-district meetings. However, these tips and resources can be applied to your Hill Day meetings, and I'm going to drop a link to the toolkit in the chat. And by the way, all of the resources we share will be sent to you all after. So if you don't catch it in the chat, that's totally fine. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So meeting with a member of Congress to urge them to support your cause is the most direct form of advocacy and a good way to start building a relationship with that particular office, which will help in the long term when it comes to other advocacy opportunities. I just want to quickly walk through some meeting tips that you can use when scheduling and preparing for your meeting. And I also want to note that later in the webinar, we'll be hearing from one of our state partners who has had experience with Hill Day meetings in person and in a hybrid format, but I'm just going to give some general tips when it comes to these meetings. Hill Day will be on March 23rd. So with that in mind, it's good to schedule at least 2 weeks or more in advance of Hill Day. And you can do this by sending an email to the office scheduler using the meeting request template that NLIHC has provided as a guide. And you can reach out to NLIHC's field team if you need congressional contact information or scheduler contact information. And I'm going to drop 2 links in the chat, one with the scheduling meetings resource, as well as the meeting request template. Other things to keep in mind when making the request is to let the office know what issue you plan on discussing, the number of people attending the meeting, if constituents will be in attendance, your availability, and if this is an in-person or virtual meeting. If this is a virtual meeting, make sure you confirm which meeting platform will be used, such as Zoom or Google Meet. And if it's an in-person meeting, make sure to confirm the location of the meeting. I also want to note that it's important to have a connection to the state or congressional district represented by the office you're meeting with, like if you're a constituent and a voter, or if your organization serves their constituents. And next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, prepping for your meeting. In preparation for your meeting, make sure you know who will be in attendance, what everyone's roles are, your agenda, and your talking points. If you're meeting as a group, designating roles to each person in your group, such as a facilitator or a note taker, can help keep the meeting organized, as well as discussing in advance who in your group will open, close, and deliver specific asks. Make sure to do your research on the elected officials you're meeting with so you can connect your work to their interests as much as possible. If you can connect your work on affordable housing and homelessness issues to their interests, it can create a connection that can lead to a stronger relationship as you move forward. And before your meeting, make sure to practice, gather all the materials you need, such as leave behind documents, outline an agenda, review the talking points you want to discuss, and if you're meeting virtually, make sure to test your technology. Later in the webinar, we'll be hearing more about how to weave your personal narrative into your advocacy meetings, but I still want to note that storytelling, which adds personal narratives into advocacy to show how policies impact real people, can add an emotional and powerful component to your advocacy. NLIHG has a one-pager on storytelling tips, which you can find at the link I dropped in the chat. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. During your meeting. So first, make sure you're on time for your meeting. In this case, you want to get there around 10 minutes before the start time, if that's something you can do. Remember to open your meetings up with introductions and make sure to mention your connection to the state or congressional district represented by the office you're meeting with. Stick to your agenda, your speaking points, and make sure to actively listen and ask any questions. Also, if you don't know the answer to a question you receive, saying, I don't know, or I will follow up with an answer is perfectly acceptable. And it's a great way to make an excuse, I guess, to follow up with that office as well. Also, make sure to take detailed notes, especially on any feedback or follow-up information that you need. Also, this is an opportunity to educate your elected officials or their staff about the affordable housing crisis in your community if they're not already familiar with it. You can do this by providing the person you're meeting with NLIHG materials, and you can refer to those materials during your meeting. In this case, one of those materials will be a 2-pager that we'll be sending out after this webinar. You can also provide any materials ahead of time through email. And make sure to provide data and stories about the issues you're advocating for, because this will really solidify the reason you're meeting with them and your cause. Something else to make sure of is to make a specific ask in your meeting that can be answered with a yes or no question. For example, something that one would ask would be something like, will you oppose cuts to federal investments in affordable housing and homelessness programs? Most likely, they're not going to give a yes or no answer during the meeting, and they'll say they'll have to consider it. You can use this as an opportunity to follow up later. And make sure to confirm who you should follow up with, and make sure to thank the person you're meeting with. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, after your meeting, remember that no advocacy meeting is the final conversation, and the best advocacy focuses on sustained relationship building rather than single conversations. After the meeting, you can tweet your members of Congress to publicly thank them and their staff, and make sure to include a photo of the meeting if you have one. If you're in a virtual if you were in a virtual meeting, taking a screenshot of your meeting and sharing it is also great, but I do want to note that if you are taking a picture or a screenshot, make sure to ask permission that before doing so. Publicly thanking a member of Congress can strengthen your relationship with their office because you're, one, publicly showing gratitude for their time, but more importantly, this can also serve as a reminder that they're accountable to follow up on the commitments they made to you, or to get more information about the questions they said they wanted answers to. If you're going to tweet about the meeting, make sure to mention your members of Congress and NLIHG. Also, make sure to let us know how the meeting went, any outcomes, what was discussed, and what you learned. We can go to the next slide, actually. Thank you. So this is a slide of resources that will be shared with you all after this webinar, and just resources you can use for your meetings. But an additional resource I do want to highlight is the housing needs by state data, which includes vital information on the state of affordable housing in the state or district the office represents. This is a great collection of various data sets and a compelling fact sheet to present to members of Congress and all of their staff. And I'll drop a link to the housing needs by state page in the chat box. And I also want to note that when you click on the link and you go to your state, you can access both congressional district profiles and state housing profiles. And I want to note that we'll also be releasing a 2-pager with all of the policy priorities that Kim discussed, with some information and facts about each that can serve as a guide to prepare for your meetings, as well as a convenient leave behind document for your meeting. This will be included in the folders we'll be distributing for Hill Day participants. And if you're a virtual participant, we'll also be sending these through email as well after the webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, we are here to help. If this is your first time advocating on Capitol Hill, it could be intimidating, but remember that you are the expert on your experience with these issues. We are here to help with any questions you have along the way. And on this slide is the contact information for all the organizers at NLIHC that you can reach out to. Also want to note that most of the states have a state captain that has the role of coordinating meetings with Hill Day participants from their states. So make sure to be in touch with them. And if you don't know who your state captain is, you can reach out to the NLIHC field team and we'll point you in the right direction. And also, as you schedule your meetings, make sure to let us know who you're meeting with and when your meeting is taking place. And I'm going to drop, oh, perfect. Thank you, Sayed, for dropping the field map in there. So you can click on that link and it'll take you to our NLIHC field map where you'll see which organizer is assigned to your state. All right, thank you so much. And I will pass it to Andrew.
Thanks so much, Gabby, and thanks, Kim. It's good to see everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're great.
Well, my name is Andrew Bradley. I'm Policy Director with Prosperity Indiana. We're the Indiana state partner for NLIHC. And I was asked to speak in this part of the discussion because I've done this before. In fact, it was probably about a decade ago that I did my first Capitol Hill visits, not on housing, but on other issues. And first of all, I just want to say, I see in the chat, Nicole Jackson saying, it's my first time and excited, and that's great. You should be excited. And even for people who this is their first time, there are ways to have positive, meaningful engagements, even if it's your first time or if it's your 20th time doing this kind of thing. And I think the NLIHC has done a great job of providing, today, a lot of different resources from data, from storytelling. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of that firsthand perspective of what it's like to go through that process. So I may repeat a couple of things that Gabby talked about, but want to give you kind of some practical examples of how these things play out. So the first thing I'm doing, I dropped in the link, is a map to Capitol Hill, to the offices and to like the metro stops, and just getting a sense for that physical layout, especially if this is your first time there. And if you're in charge of doing some of the scheduling, you really want to be thinking about the ground you're traveling. Capitol Hill is a big area. If you try to go from the Senate side, a Senate office building, over to a House side, one meeting after the next, and then back again, you're going to wear your team out. So what I always do myself is when I'm scheduling those meetings, I think about, usually I start the morning on the Senate side. I try to get our 2 senators in first, and then give us some time to cross over by the Capitol, good chance to snap some photos in front of the Capitol building and turn around and there's the Supreme Court. Especially for first timers, that's a great opportunity. And then to schedule those House office buildings together as much as possible. I think we might be able to cover this a little more, get some additional answers in the Q&A, but from my understanding, during COVID, when I did this last year, there were some restrictions on entering those office buildings. Sounds like some of those have been relaxed, and you should be able to go to the office buildings and then go through security. You'll want to keep in mind, you wouldn't want to take anything you wouldn't take on a plane. You'll go through a metal detector, but like laptops are good, papers are good, all that type of meeting stuff is just fine, but you want to give yourself time to get through, and so that you're not rushing and feeling hurried. And then, so in terms of that scheduling and doing that work, you want to do that well ahead of time. They said you want to do it at least 2 weeks in advance. I would suggest if you're the state captain and you haven't yet, start reaching out this week so that you have the most opportunity to select your slots during that day. And you can, if one office is busy and you have to come back in the afternoon, that you're building in that walking and transition time. It is tiring to do that type of work, especially if you have new folks with you. Also just want to think about what it means to be in those meetings and how that's important. I know in just a minute, Marisol is going to talk about the importance of storytelling. I just want to emphasize a little bit the importance of using all of the resources that you have in front of you. So that resource that Gabby dropped in, those state housing profiles, those are really important. I really think what I just dropped in, this is the version for Indiana, these congressional district profiles are really important because especially those House members, they're thinking about their district and you want to be able to use stats that speak to what they're interested in. Another thing that they're thinking about is what affects, they're listening to their constituents. So if you don't have a constituent from Indiana 1st District with you, we're going to make sure that in our virtual meeting, when we bring a laptop, we're going to make sure that we have somebody from that district on the line with us. So, be thinking about that and be really intentional about who you have in the meeting and making sure that you have that district anchor for them to talk with. Those don't have to be the only people that talk, but it's probably good for that person to say, kick off the conversation for that particular meeting. And as far as it goes, making sure that you're really using people in the room in your delegation to tell different aspects of the stories. Somebody, if they're good with data or something, they might be the one to talk from the district profile. You might have somebody, a tenant with lived experience, either in person or on the line, that can help provide real stories. And it sounds like we're going to hear more about that. And just as Gabby said, you always want to make sure that you're rotating asks too, that you're connecting those stories and you're connecting that data to the specific agenda items that NLIHC has brought forward. That's going to be really helpful because so that you're thinking ahead about constructing a narrative, making certain points and making specific asks, and then providing ways to follow up with those staffers. And that's something else that's worth mentioning is you may not even be meeting with a member of Congress themselves. You might be meeting with a staffer, and sometimes that's just as good. It can be really helpful to develop an ongoing relationships with a staffer who works day in and day out with these issues. A member meeting is great if you can get it. It's worth asking for, especially if you could get a key photo op. But even what I would do is, maybe get a 5-minute member meeting and photo op, but then ask to sit down with the staffers after that. That's been our strategy when we're reaching out to some of our folks. Let's see. So just a little bit in terms of what to expect. My understanding is that going from meeting to meeting, you want to be aware that the tunnels between the buildings may not be available. So between meetings, every time you switch buildings, you might have to go out and back through security again. So again, just in terms of scheduling, something to think about. Both the House and the Senate side do have some restaurants, dining areas available. May not be the biggest selection available, but that's something else you want to think and plan ahead about. And I dropped in the one for the Senate side. There's also one on the House side. Last year when I checked, the public weren't able to just wander into the gift shops. That's something else to think about. It could be something that's meaningful for you and the members of your delegation, especially if they're first timers. And just want to think again about that it's important to think ahead and plan and prep, especially for those hybrid meetings. I did this process last year. I made sure for each meeting that we had that run of show ready. And if I'm swapping in that district anchor role, that everybody is familiar coming in exactly what to expect so that you're minimizing what can happen with people not knowing what link to click, that you've done all that ahead of time. So you might want to use some of the weeks in between now and then to, do a prep meeting, to do a run through. And so if you're that state captain, that's why that can be really important. Let's see. I think that that's probably enough for now for me. I'll drop my contact info into the chat. I know the NLIHC staff, they're your primary contacts, but for some reason I can be helpful. I'm happy to do that. All right. And so let me turn it back over to NLIHC.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. And you are always helpful. It's very funny you said, in case you can be, as if you are not always. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for helping us, know what to expect the day of. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Marisol. Boop. Let's see, there it is. Marisol Bello, who's the Executive Director of Housing Narrative Lab. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that she can share hers. So Marisol, take it away.
Super. I think actually Gabby or Sid were going to share. Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. I'm super excited to talk with you all. Gabby mentioned and Andrew mentioned a bit about storytelling. And so our next 15 minutes is really looking at why and how your story are so important. And the thing I want you all to know and remember is that your story is the single most important element in your advocacy. So if you can turn to the next slide. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes, and to the next one, please. We're going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about the why, sort of the big why. The why is that as humans, we connect and we tell stories as the form of communication, right? Story is how people see and understand the world. It shapes how we think and how we build connections to the things and the people around us. And so that's what you will be doing. You will be telling your story so that you can create connection with your MOCs. You are looking for that connection with them because you are also looking at ways to build trust with them, right? So let's go to the next slide. Let's dig into the next one. We're going to dig in a little bit more into some of the deeper whys. And again, Gabby talked a little bit about this, right? The feeling, it's the hearts part of the hearts and minds. And so people take action based on how they feel. Oh, you can stop right there. People take action based on how they feel. I know that as advocates, we want to give people the data and just the facts and this is wrong and let me tell you why. And all of that is true, but it's not going to get you what you need to get to. It's not going to help people move. It's not going to help to move people. It's not going to help to move them to action. And so the whole reason that you are going to be talking to your MOCs, you're going to be talking to your members of Congress, is to get them to act. And the way you get them to act is to start to talk with them about the ways, think about what is it that I can get them to understand and to feel. Feeling is important, and the feelings and emotions that can move people to action. If you can scroll back a couple, so we can just highlight the 4 elements: pride, hope, love, and awe. Those are feelings that we have seen in cognitive science and in research. Those are feelings that can move people to action. So stories that show and elicit pride, stories that show and elicit hope, i.e., yes, we can, right? Love is love, right? Awe. Those are the feelings and emotions that can move people to action. Now, if you can go to the next slides. Right, to the emotions to use sparingly. Anger, fear, and sadness. We often, as advocates, we want to go to anger, we want to go to fear. We want to show people that if you don't take action, bad things will happen. And while it is true, it won't move people to action, because what this actually does is stories that elicit anger, stories that get people angry, stories that make people fearful. Actually, we have seen from research that it closes people off. And so the very thing that you want your MOCs to do, which is to invest more money, right, to commit without any, to offer that commitment to investments in housing, they're not going to do that if they're thinking fear and anger. It actually evokes a cognitive response of closing off, so not opening, which is where we want people to be. Can you go to the next few slides? So I'm going to talk about your story of self in 3 parts. First is the story of you, right? This is you. This is like, why are you here? Why are you talking to this person? What are your values and experiences that make you the leader on this issue? This is where your story is going to show your empowerment. You go to the next slides. Okay. The story of you by itself won't get us completely there. So you need to tie your story of you to the story of us. We together as a community, right, can do this. So join us, said so-and-so legislator or MOC, join us to create this vision that we need and that we want for our people. So you start with your story of you, connect it to your story of us, and then you get to the third piece, which is the story of action. Right? And this is critical to our story of self as it ties to your advocacy and all of the stories you will be telling when you are talking to your MOCs, which is really connecting your story to what you want the person to do, right? What you want your legislator to do, because otherwise we're just telling a story, but we're not really kind of connecting it to the broader issue. And this is where those great talking points that the coalition has shared with you, this is where the two will connect. So let's go to the next slide, because I actually want to get to, keep going, to the how we are going to do that. And at the end, I'm going to give you an example. First thing you want to do is focus your story. Too often we want to tell people the whole song and dance. We want to tell people everything about our story, but guess what? You have 10 minutes. So you can't really do that. Or you, in some cases you have 2, right? So you really have to zero in and focus on your story. And the way you focus is you think about, what is it that I want at the end of this? At the end of this, right? Am I trying to mobilize a legislator who is on our side, but we need them to kind of be energized, or need them to be energized and to maybe bring in some more of their colleagues? Or am I trying to persuade a legislator, right, to offer more investments? You can go to the next slide. So once you have that focus, right, you start to think of, okay, well, what is the value? What is the feeling that I am trying to evoke and that I want them to walk away with? Go ahead to the next slide, please. So we think of our story as a value. Are we trying to, is the value that we want to bring our community together? Is the value that we know that home is the place where we can all thrive, and that will strengthen our community, right? So when you're telling your story, you focus it, you think about what is the value that I want to share with this legislator. And this is where your background research is really going to help you, so that you can see, what does this legislator really value? What is important to them, and how am I shaping my story to also meet their value? Because where my value and their values meet, that's the place where I want to be. So when you're telling your story, then you want to talk about the value. We want this in our community. This is our shared value, but it's not all of us are able to get there, because I've had challenges. And this is where you talk about what you've had to overcome. This is really specific. Some of this may feel specific to people with lived experience, but you can adapt this if you are a provider as well, right? So if you are, if you've had a challenge because you don't have enough funding, that's a challenge that you've had to overcome. Really, really looking at what is the thing that you've had to deal with. Go to the next slide, please. Right. So then here, you talk about the challenges you've had, and then you talk about the choices that you've made, right, to overcome them. Like, what is the choice that you had to make? I had to decide if I was going to live in my car for a few more months or live on somebody's couch, or if I'm a provider, I had to decide, am I going to be able to offer X number of days of service or curtail the service, or what is that? What was that going to look like? What was the choice? Okay, go to the next slide. Every story has a resolution. What was the outcome? So this is really where you, again, right? We talked in the beginning about the single most important element of your advocacy is your story. This is where you show your power. This is where you show, right, your empowerment. So what was the outcome of this? You can go to the next slide. And then connect it back. So call to action. The reason we're all here is because we want them to do something. So when we're telling the story of self, we're looking at the focus, right? We're researching what is it that, where do I need to start my story, right? What part of my story am I gonna share? And I'm gonna think about what is the value for this particular legislator, and it may have to change, right? Based on the legislators that you're talking to. What is the value? What is the shared value that we have? I'm going to describe my challenge. I'm going to show the choices I had to make. I'm going to describe the resolution, what was the outcome, and I'm going to bring it all back to my call to action. Right? So this is because that's why we're there. What is that we want them to do? All right, you can go to the next slide. And this is where I'm going to give you an example. So we are, and we're going to share all of this with you. So all of you will have this, but this is a little handy dandy worksheet that we have pulled together at the lab to help people tell their story of self, particularly tell their story of self for advocacy and action. So as you all are thinking this through, you can use this worksheet to help guide you. It's basically what I just laid out for you very quickly. But then it gives you the opportunity to start to kind of form and shape that. So I'm going to give you an example in the next few slides of what I mean. I've put it all together here for you to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So here's the beginning of a story. I want to live in a community where my husband, my son, and I are stable and safe. I want to live in a community where my husband and I can find jobs to pay us enough so we don't have to worry about our basic needs, especially a stable home. And I want my son to feel safe and rested so he can get up in the morning with the energy that he needs so he doesn't have to struggle as much as mom and dad. Tons of value in there, right? Community, family, love, education, son, thriving, right? Stable home. That's how we're starting off with value. Next, yes, Alex, we are going to be sharing all of this with you. So next piece of it, as I continue my story, is my challenge, right? But hasn't been easy for us. We're furloughed. Our landlord kept increasing the rent. He raises it every year, and every year it's harder for us to pay. So he's evicted us, and we couldn't find a place that we could afford because why? The places we could afford, right, were bad for our health. My son has asthma. And so we were running into apartments that had mold, they had peeling paint, they had roach infestations. So what did we have to do? We had to live in our car for a bit. We slept in a relative's couch, but clearly that's not a stable life for an adult, let alone a 10-year-old child. Going back to the value of stability and home that we raised in the beginning, right? Let's go to the next piece of our story. So value, challenge, climax. We were so overwhelmed with fear and worry. It's hard to figure out what to do next. So I have a friend. She told us about an apartment in her complex, and she heard from somebody else about rental assistance. Maybe I could apply. So during that time, we took my son to the library because it was so quiet and safe, and they had computers there. So there's a choice now, right, that I had to make. The next piece is the outcome. We applied online during one of those visits to the library. And when the notice came, right, that we received emergency rental assistance, I cried. Right? The assistance was a lifeline, and it was just enough to help us find the stability we needed. Our son is back to school at 100% attendance, and he even had a part in the school play because now he had a home where he could practice. And my husband and I weren't in fight or flight mode, so one of us could always be there to help him rehearse. Outcome, right? And what was the thing that helped us? It was that emergency rental assistance. Let's go to the call to action. Bring it all back home. My family's experience is the experience of so many in your district who are just one crisis or one trauma away from being on the street. And that's why, Senator, Legislator XYZ, we need you to join us to choose more investment in rental assistance for families, more investment for homes that people can afford, even if they have a crisis like my family, because we know when each of us have a stable, decent home that we can afford, we can find good jobs for our kids do better in school, and that strengthens our entire community. For those of you that received your coalition talking points, that last piece, those are your talking points from the coalition, but we put them in the context of this larger story, where I told you the story of me. I brought it around to the story of us, and then tied it up in a bow with the call to action, because the story of me by itself doesn't matter. The story of us has to be told, and we need them. And let me back up. I don't mean that the story of me doesn't matter. What I am trying to say more is that the story of me has to be told in the context of the story of us and our call to action. So I think is there another slide? I think that was the end of it. No, I think just questions. You all will receive this PowerPoint as well as the worksheet. And if you have any questions, you want to run your story by me, anything like that, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. And it also includes any further reading for those of you that want to geek out on storytelling. My friend John Brady can tell you that I geek out in a big way on all things story. So thank you, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marisol. I am also a huge geek about, stories. So more than happy to geek out with you anytime. So in our remaining time together, we just wanted to go through some of the questions. So if you have an outstanding question, please pop it in the Q&A, and I'll hand it on over to Gabby, who's going to help facilitate.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my Zoom froze, so I heard you said you were gonna pass it to me, so I wasn't sure when you stopped talking, but I'm okay. I'm back.
No worries.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you so much, Marisol and Andrew, for joining us today. I'm so happy you guys were able to join us and just provide us such great information. Okay, so I'm gonna go to our first question, which I think, Kim, you might be able to answer this one. This is from Ryan Bell, and he asks, how can I learn what full funding means?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. So full funding is a little bit of a question mark right now when it comes to public housing and homeless assistance grants. We work really closely with our partners who work in more in that space in order to get that number. So basically, we're waiting on our partners to tell us how much money they need, and then our requests will reflect the number that they give us. So by the time Hill Day rolls around, we're going to have an updated quote unquote full funding number for you. But for now, we're just saying full funding is something of a placeholder.
Thank you so much, Kim. And our next question is from David Tucker. They ask, this question may have been answered in the presentation, but do you have any advice on how to speak against Cicero Institute's state bills criminalizing homelessness? My state, Kansas, is currently fighting one of these bills.
Yeah, that is another great question. I am going to drop a link in the chat to all of our resources on homelessness and housing first. One of the big kind of overarching points that we like to make about Housing First is that it's evidence-based and it works. The evidence shows that when you give somebody housing with supportive services when needed and when they want them, people are more likely to stay housed in the long term. So in addition to looking at some of the resources that are available on our website at that link that I just dropped, I would really encourage folks to join the Housing First webinar series that we're conducting with the National Alliance to End Homelessness for more tips and ideas about how to combat some of those Cicero Institute bills and to advance Housing First. Also, please feel free to reach out, and thank you so much to the advocate who asked that question in the chat for all of the work that you're doing in your state to fight against that, fight against those proposals.
Thank you so
Can I
much.
add one quick thing as well to that, because that's such a key area right now that so many folks are zeroing in on as it relates to homelessness. And the one thing I want to just put a kind of added pin to something that Kim was just saying about making the case for why Housing First works versus arguing against Cicero. And so keeping that in mind as when you're thinking about both narrative and messaging around this is really thinking about, like, what is it about our solution that's going to work? And our solution in this case, obviously, is Housing First. And the other two things I wanted to just mention around that was really positioning the community piece of Housing First and what it does to build and strengthen communities. I think that's also really important. And then the second piece is actually highlighting in a kind of a, not as directly, but really highlighting how they see the world as simply. And I don't mean to say Cicero sees the world simply, but looking at some people see the world simply, like homelessness is a choice, but we know that that's not the case. We know the reality. So I'm adding to what Kim is saying because it's so clear on the, absolutely on the policy side. And then when you combine that with the communication side or on how you talk about it, some of these tips may be helpful to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marisol and Kim. And I'm going to combine these next two questions since we're nearing time, and these are kind of like logistical questions. The first one is, what time does Hill Day start? So Hill Day starts at 8 a.m. We have a morning session to kick off the day, starting at 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. And Hill Day meetings can start as early as 9:30 a.m. We do have a location for the Hill Day morning session. It is actually at the National American Indian Housing Council's building, which is on C Street Northwest in DC. I don't have the exact number, but in our follow-up email, we'll be sending out all that information so you all will have it on hand. Thank you for asking that question. And the second question will NLIHC give a list of folks attending Advocacy Day? It'll be nice to coordinate with other attendees from my area to sync our meeting request if possible. Yeah, so like I said in my portion, most states have a state captain that is coordinating meetings. The state captain is are usually our state partners. So they've been coordinating meetings and reaching out to participants from their state as we send those lists to them. So if you've already signed up for Hill Day, or if you want to ask directly who your state captain is, and how to get in contact with them, you can just send us an email. You can either send me an email, or if you can look on that field map that we dropped in the chat earlier for your state's organizer, and they can put you in contact with your state captain. I hope that answered your question. Well, we're at 5 now. Do we have time for one more question, or should we wrap it up?
I have time for another question if other folks do.
Okay, sure. Let's see. There are a couple questions that I think deserve like a longer answer, so I'm not going to get into those, but we can probably follow up with people after the meeting. But this is a quick question. Are meetings virtual, in person, or hybrid? This Hill Day is hybrid. So if you can join in person, and if you're attending Forum and you'll be in DC, feel free to join in person. However, if you're not in DC or for whatever reason, virtual works for you, you can schedule virtual meetings as well. So this is a hybrid Hill Day. And we can get one more question. Is NLIHC supporting with scheduling meetings with electeds, or do we need to schedule those on our own? Would be great if NLIHC could facilitate this. So we are supporting attendees with figuring out who to contact, and just supporting people with tools and resources. But when it comes to scheduling meetings, and Kim, you can jump in on this, I believe it's better if the person scheduling the meeting is an actual constituent of that person's office or has a direct connection with that person's office. So yes, we can help, but as far as actually calling or sending an email to schedule the meeting, that would be up to the attendee or the state captain.
Yeah, I think that, that sounds right to me. If folks are a little bit, anxious about reaching out to their member offices, talk to your state captain. They can also be like, hey, we would like to meet, oh, Gabby, you're a kitty cat. We would like to meet with you. We have a constituent, just make note that a constituent of yours wants to talk to you about this. So, you know, it's not all on any one person. We're happy to help out where we can.
Thank you so much. One more question, or is we're already at 5:02, but all right, one more question. This person asked, also interested in a specific number as we focus on Section 9 and public housing and tribal nation funding as we are under the same HUD office.
Yeah, we're going to have those specific numbers by Hill Day, just working with our partners to figure out what they're asking for, so that we're, you know, not stepping on any toes or, you know, under asking what they actually want or anything like that. So we'll have those numbers for you soon.
Cool. And I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much. So we will be sending out these slides to you all after this webinar, and this was recorded, so we'll be sure to post this on our YouTube page, and also I believe share this with you all, this recording with you all in the follow-up email as well. So yes, thank you so much for joining us today, and if you have any questions, please reach out to us.
Thank you all so much for joining. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.